Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. I think I always start the same, don't I? And I think I always have the same intonation as well when I do that intro, right? Oh, what can you do? So this video we are finally cracking into Bergson. We're going to be looking at basically two things: the intensity of psychic states and multiplicity. So let's make a start. Let's get into intensity first. So the intensity of psychic states. Let's just think about psychic states for a minute. So why psychic states? Anyway, let me start with this. Instead of something like consciousness. So the reason, and I'm going to use psychic states as much as possible throughout this series, because that's what Bergson uses, and it's always good, I think, to if you really want to understand a philosopher, to get into the lingo, use the language that they use, the terms they use, and I think that helps with your understanding of the material. So psychic states, and also so that's the first reason. And also, the word consciousness is hugely problematic these days. There's so much baggage associated with it that really, when you use it, it's immediately unclear, I think, what you're talking about. Consciousness, are you talking about like first person experience? Are you talking about like a self-reflective awareness? Are you talking about qualia? Are you talking about what it's like to be something or to experience something? The whole thing has just become so confusing and so unhelpful that I think there's real value in going back to basics and trying to disentangle all of these associated notions, which just get bundled in with the word consciousness. So I'm going to avoid using that. We are going to talk about consciousness actually later, but as much as possible, I'm going to use psychic states. So a psychic state, and the reason this is so useful, I think, is it's just clear what we mean when you say a psychic state, right? It's just a state of your mind at any given moment. How you feel. Are you happy? Are you sad? That happiness that you feel, that's just a psychic state. What are you thinking about? That's a psychic state. It's just the state of your mind, right? So it's a nice and clear concept. We all know what we're talking about, and there's no confusion. So intensity of psychic states. When we talk about psychic states, when we talk about feelings, thoughts, or desires, any of those things, but a pain, the sensation of a pain, we tend to think of them in terms of quantities or magnitudes, when actually Bergson says they're intensities, which are fundamentally different things. So, and this, although we would, I think, if you ask someone, right, do you think of your psychic state as an intensity, or as something you can measure, as something quantifiable? Few people would come out and say, yeah, no, it's something measurable. It's something. Most of us would say it's something not measurable. It's something experiential, right? It has to be experienced, and it's only able to be experienced. But that's kind of what we explicitly say. But then when we break it down and when we think about it, we end up cashing it out as if it were something quantifiable, as if it were something that we can count, or something that we can add to. And I'll discuss that a little bit later. But that's kind of the opening position, I guess. We tend to think of psychic states in terms of quantities. I'll explain how in just a moment, but actually they are intensities. That's Bergson's first point. The second point is that different stages of psychic states are differences in kind, not degree. So we've already said that psychic states aren't quantifiable, they're not measurable, but there are different stages, right? You can progress from, say, feeling sad to feeling happy to feeling elated. And those different stages but exist, but they're not on a continuum. You don't move, you don't progress from one incrementally through to the next, and then again incrementally to the next, because that's a quantifiable way of thinking about it. It's a quantitative way of thinking about it, as if these states were measurable, as if they were things that we can add to get to higher degrees of intensity. So they're not those things. They can't be measured in any meaningful way. And when we see psychic states in this way, when we think of them as quantitative, as measurable, what we're doing is spatializing them. We're treating them as things in space, which doesn't mean literally as if the mind is in like a three-dimensional space. But Bergson means we're treating it as if we're imagining the mind in a spatial setting, with a spatial background, so that we can put one psychic state here, another psychic state here, combine them. You can only do that if you're thinking in terms of space, because you've got a here and a there, right? That's the only way that quantitative thinking can take place, if you're dealing with space, and that's going to be a majorly important theme as these videos go on. So in general, the mistake in thinking of psychic states as things we can measure or things we can quantify is that we're spatializing them. So we're spatializing something which is fundamentally inextensive. That is to say, it's an intensity. Okay, so let's have a look at what intensity means then. So intensity, I've broken this down into three categories, three things, 3 points. So intensity first, it's an irreducible property of psychic states, which isn't extensive. We've talked about that already. It's something which can only be felt, has no spatial connotations at all. But this is the point that I wanted to make here. It can't be derived from extensive causes. So we can't get intensities from extensive causes. And the way that Bergson describes this, he says there's nothing in common between superposable magnitudes like vibration amplitudes and sensations that don't occupy space. So this is basically the same as saying, the way we'd say it these days, I think, is how do you get consciousness from non-conscious matter in the brain? That's basically the same thing. But the way Bergson frames it is, if you think about, we think that usually the brain is generating consciousness or psychic states. Psychic states are emerging from the brain, which means that because the brain is just a part it's a causal, it has a causal role, it has a causal function in a longer causal chain, right? So you receive these extensive, again, so in space, the superposable magnitudes like vibration, so things that electromagnetic waves or something like that, impacting the retina, getting converted to electrical signals, and yada, 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 the whole process. These are all things that are happening in space. These are all extended causes. One thing causes another, but each of the effects is also extensive. So there's no problem. You've got extensive causes producing extensive effects. And those extensive effects go on to produce other extensive effects, no problem. But then suddenly, somehow, you get to this point where the effect becomes something intensive, an intensity, a psychic state. That, for Bergson, flat out is incoherent. So even the notion that we can get, if we look hard enough, we're going to be able to find a way for extensive causes to produce intensities, intensive psychic states, is just a non-starter. The two share absolutely nothing in common. And I think you have to start from that position. There's no other way that you can understand consciousness. And that's why we're at an impasse now with consciousness. Science has made absolutely no inroads on that. Despite all of the effort, I think, that's going into it, we're not even a tiny fraction closer to understanding how consciousness arises in the brain, or how psychic states manifest. And I think the reason for that is, as Bergson says, there is no cause-effect relationship here. We're going to have to completely rethink our whole picture of this process. So that's the first point about intensity. Irreducible property of psychic states. It's not extensive and can't be derived from extensive causes. So what is it? Can we get something positive? Let me give you a quote. Intensity is a certain quality of shade which spreads over a more or less considerable mass of psychic states. Now this is a really nice way of thinking about this. Intensity, it's a quality of shade. It's intrinsically something qualitative. It's there in the words, right? The quality of shade. It tinges our psychic states. It's not just another psychic state, but it imbues other psychic states with this kind of a quality, a color. It colors them in a certain way. It gives us a feeling, and that's the best way to describe this, I think. Necessarily imprecise, necessarily ambiguous, but I think if you really want to understand consciousness, you have to get comfortable with with ambiguity, with haziness, because consciousness, psychic states, these aren't things that you can quantify. You can't put numbers on these things. We have to think about them in a completely different way, in a non-scientific way, which is going to rub every scientist completely the wrong way. But yeah, this is I think a nice way of thinking about it. A change of quality, not of magnitude. Nothing is being added to anything here when we change, when we move from one psychic state to another. We're not adding anything, we're not taking anything away, we're not combining, we're not grouping together. These are all spatial ways of thinking, and that's not what's happening here. Psychic states are not spatial, they're fundamentally inextensive. And so we've got to think about them in that way. If that's what they really are, if that's what they fundamentally are, we have to respect that. And the only way we'll be able to get a grip on psychic states is if we take them the way that they actually are, which is inextensive. And so I wanted to just talk here a little bit about the magnitudes, quantities, the way I said we tend to think of psychic states in spatial terms. And yet, if I were to ask anyone, do you think your psychic states are spatial? No one would say yes. But that doesn't change the fact that I think we tend to think in spatial terms without realizing it. So we might think of certain psychic states as in relation to each other as being perhaps having a contained relation. So you've got, let's say, just a slight happiness. You're slightly happy compared to kind of fuller experience of happiness compared to elation or joy. So you got those three different levels. And the progression then from one to the other, how do we think about that? You might think something like, definitely, or almost certainly, I would say you would imagine a continuum. There's a happiness continuum, and you're steadily moving up it or down it. And that already you can see as spatial. If you think of a continuum, you're already thinking in terms of space. And you're thinking of moving from this lower part to this higher part. And that can be done perhaps by adding more happiness, whatever that might be, or taking it away and moving back down the continuum. But again, a spatial way of thinking about it, which treats happiness as if it's quantifiable, as if it's something we can count, something we can apportion and measure. Units of happiness, right? And this might sound crazy, but I don't think it is that far removed from what we see. I mean, people are trying to measure consciousness, trying to put a number on it. Phi, that's the integrated information theory, right? Phi tells you, it's supposed to tell you how conscious a system is. Literally trying to measure consciousness, which is something that Bergson would find completely ridiculous. So anyway, back to the continuum. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way, maybe you think of a little bit of happiness is kind of this much, and the medium level of happiness is a bigger container, which holds this little amount of happiness. And then elation is like the biggest container, which has all of these other levels in it. Again, that's a spatial way of thinking. Again, it treats happiness, psychic states, as something which are measurable, which are quantifiable, and it's missing the fundamental truth that these things are qualitative, not quantitative. And this is just the result of, this is just how we think. We automatically think in terms of space. We think in terms of numbers. We think in terms of measurements. So it's not that we're doing something foreign to our nature. We're completely following our nature. It's just that is not getting us to the truth of psychic states. So that's the second point. Intensity is this, we have to think of it as a kind of quality of shade which spreads throughout our psychic states, throughout a number of psychic states. Although notice you can't even say that without drifting into spatial metaphors. So just bear that in mind, actually. It's just so natural to us. We can't even formulate the concepts without drifting into spatial thought. But if we're not aware of it, that takes us off down the garden path of spatial thinking to something which fundamentally cannot grasp, something which is not spatial, something which is inextensive. So then, the final point, we've got these different, we've got these psychic states which differ nevertheless in degrees of intensity. So there are stages we can progress through. But each of these stages is qualitatively different from the others. So there's no, and this is what I said before, a difference in kind, not degree, from these psychic states. A little bit of happiness is not, elation is not the same kind of thing, just more of a normal level of happiness, which is not the same kind of thing, just more of a little bit of happiness. These are fundamentally different, qualitatively different states. Differences in kind, not degree. And that, if you've ever read Kierkegaard, will bring to mind the notion of the leap, the qualitative leap. And the idea with that is basically just that there are no intervening steps between two states. So you go from this one to this one, but there's no track, there's no path from the one to the other. It's a qualitative leap. It's a leap that happens and can only happen. How do you even describe it? It can only happen as a kind of a total transition from one state to another. There's no gradation. There's no steady progression from the one to the other. It's just a sudden and complete transition. So that's the idea of the leap. And Bergson gives us a couple of examples which I'll run through because they're quite illuminating, I think. He talks about desire first, which starts as a localized feeling, but as it grows, permeates a larger number of psychic elements, tinging them, so to speak, with its own color. And lo, your outlook on the whole of your surroundings seems now to have changed radically. So trying to capture that idea that desire, it's not a steady incremental increase of some kind of property. It starts as this localized feeling, but then it takes over, spreads to a wider number of psychic states, tinging them with that desire, and then as it grows, as it encapsulates, as it spreads to more of these psychic states, it takes over more of your being, more of your character, and then so that's what differentiates a real intense desire from just a kind of pedestrian one. It's not something which is being added. It's not a steady increase in one quality separate from others. It's this kind of force or qualitative change that's changing other psychic states. It's seeping through your being, and that's the way that it's affecting this change, such that any two states are not identifiable as being the result of a progression from an earlier one. So that's important. Even though I talked about that seeping through, that sounds very incremental, but Bergson's clear that these psychic states, there's a qualitative difference between the intensities. Another example is joy, which he says starts as a mental turning towards the future. That's the first state. There's nothing. It's just a kind of subtle move in the direction of the future. So joy is future directed. Then the next stage is a lightness in which our movements no longer cost us the same effort. So again, there's kind of a qualitative. It's difficult to put your finger on what's changed, but something's changed. Your movements are lighter. You're able to do things more easily than you were before. And then finally, all movements possess an indefinable feeling of heat. So that's the final stage of joy, which again is characterized by this qualitative difference that has taken over your entire way of being. Sadness also, I'll just briefly run through this one. He talks about it being initially a turn to the past, so a subtle change, not, you're not super sad just yet, but heading in that direction. The next state, an impoverishment of sensations and ideas. Then the future appears blocked or stopped up. And finally, there's a feeling of crushing failure, which aspires to nothingness. So this is how he breaks down sadness. And importantly, you could break down any of these emotions in any number of ways you wanted. Right? There's no fixed. He's not saying that these are, joy moves through these states and these states only. You could break them down into 5 different categories, 10, 20, it doesn't matter. But each of these categories is a separate, it's a fundamentally, qualitatively different state from the others. That's the point. And the last point, which is an interesting one because it's to do with perception. He talks about the way that as a light source is intensified, the hues of objects change. The colors actually change. They're not the same color in bright light as they are in dim light. But we don't notice this. We don't notice this because we've already decided to interpret changes of quality, sensation of color, as changes of quantity, changes in magnitude of the light source. And just to flesh this out a little bit, if you think about, I'm going to use the example of a piece of paper, a white piece of paper. In bright light, it looks white, right? It's bright, it's clearly white. But as the light gets dimmer, the paper also changes in color. Its hue changes. It changes from that bright white to a darker white to kind of a grey. And then it might even, depending on how dark you get, start moving into looking almost black. And yet at no point when we're looking at the paper do we think it's grey, not white. We think it's still white. The colours, the light is just dim now. So we're interpreting a qualitative change as if it's a change in quantity, the change of the magnitude, if you like, of the light source. That's what we see as changing. So the intensity of our psychic state is ignored in favor of an extensive change in the light source. Obviously, it's not a conscious decision. We haven't made a decision to ignore intensities in favor of extensities, but it's a natural way that we think. It's the natural way that we perceive. And the reason I chose a white piece of paper was because that's exactly the example that Merleau-Ponty uses in Phenomenology of Perception to discuss exactly the same thing. So score 1 for Bergson. But again, I just really want to show the connection, the links that are here. So anyway, that's the intensity of psychic states. That's how we have to think of psychic states. They're intensities, they're not extensities. Let's now turn to have a look at multiplicity. So first up here, we're going to look at number. So if we think about number, a number, let's say number 3, can be considered a unity, kind of a whole in itself, the number 3, part of the set of whole numbers or natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3. So it's just an entity unto itself, if you like, a whole, a unity. But we can also consider it to be a multiplicity. That is to say, 3 units of 1 grouped together. So there are these 2 ways we can think about number, as either a unity, a whole in itself, or as a multiplicity, a collection of smaller units. But the only way that number can be a multiplicity is in the medium of space, because we have to picture the units coexisting. So the only way I can think of 3 as a collection of 3 single units is by imagining the 3 single units existing at the same time. And if the 3 single units existing at the same time, that means by definition, I'm thinking of them existing in space, separate from each other. There's no other way to think about that. Whereas the opposite of that, if we're thinking about, if we're thinking in terms of time or succession, we only ever have one number before us at any given time. So that's kind of the opposite that Bergson is driving at here. Number can be a multiplicity only if we're thinking in terms of space. If we're thinking in terms of succession, if I think 3 individual units in terms of succession, in terms of time, over time, I can only ever have one before me at once, because that's all that can take place, right? There's no other. You can only have one thing present at once in time, in duration. Of course, I can imagine 3 things present at the same time, but that's exactly Bergson's point. 3 things present at the same time means 3 things existing at different points in space. So you can only ever get multiplicity in number through thinking in terms of space. And this gives us, in a more general sense, this gives us 2 pictures. When we're thinking of, when we're constituting number, when we're thinking of number, the unit is irreducible and the number is discontinuous. So when we're actually trying to form our impression of number, we only have the one thing before us at once. We're thinking of the one thing. Perhaps we're trying to bring 3 things together, but in doing that, we're taking one thing at a time. So the one thing is irreducible. It is a whole. It's a unity. And the 3 things that we're imagining combining appear in succession as 3 unities, as 3 wholes, as 3 discontinuous things. So that's when we're constituting number, we get that picture. The other picture, the other way of thinking about this is after the number has been formed. So after we have the concept of number, as in when we're thinking about 3, now the unit appears infinitely divisible. So now that I've got my number 3, I can chop it up in as many different ways as I want. I can break it down into single units. I can break it down into half units, 6 half units. I can continue chopping it up as far as I want to go. And that means that the number is now continuous. It's made up of an infinite number of tiny little parts, which we can, and the reason it's infinite is simply because I can chop it up in as many different parts as I want. If I want to chop it up into 3, I can do that. If I want to chop it up into 6, I can do that. 100, I can do that. And it just goes on forever. Sounds like a paradox, but it isn't. And we'll get to why much later. But this idea is quite fundamental to Bergson's thought. And this is really just kind of a side note. This corresponds to the subjective-objective distinction. So the subjective way of thinking is what is completely and adequately known as a whole, which is that first picture I was talking about, that first way of thinking. When we are constituting number, when we're forming the concept, then the units that we're taking are irreducible, they are discontinuous, they're whole in themselves. They can't be broken up, because to do that you have to get into space. You have to go beyond what you're doing at the moment, which is you're trying to piece together this concept of number. But once the number has been formed, once we've got that concept, you can break it up as much as you like, and that is the objective way of thinking, which is something that has taken on the appearance of a whole and which can be infinitely divided. So that's the second way. So there are two ways of thinking about the world. One is in constituting a concept and thinking about something, which is subjective, and that gives us this idea of unity, of the thing is just a whole in itself. And there's this other way, which is objective, which is post our thinking about the thing, after the concept's already been established, and we can cut it up into as many different pieces as we like. And that's really important. And the idea here, just tying this back into multiplicity, is that this gives us two different kinds of multiplicity. So there's the multiplicity of material objects, where things in space, things around us, right, just any normal object, in which the conception of number is immediately applicable because they are localized and countable in space. So that's that objective way of thinking, where we have the multiplicity is one of material objects. But we also have a different kind of multiplicity, which is one of psychic states. So psychic states, as we said, are intensities, fundamentally, and not extensive at all, which means they don't partake in any kind of spatiality, which means they can't be, we can't chop them up into parts. We can't treat them as quantifiable in any way. So nevertheless, there is a multiplicity here, because we can obviously have multiple psychic states, but there's only ever one before us at a time, because the psychic states appear for us in duration, not in space. So we're never, if we, just rewind a bit. So the psychic states appear for us as we experience them in time, as wholes, as complete things. This is that subjective distinction. Material objects, however, appear in space, objectively, and they appear as a whole, for sure, but as a whole which is continuous, which can be broken up into as many pieces as we want. Psychic states can also appear that way. Right? We can, that was the point of the whole first part of the video. We tend to treat psychic states as quantitative, but they can only be treated this way through a symbolical representation. So we have to we have to kind of distort what they are originally, and imagine them side by side. We have to impose kind of spatial thinking on these things which are fundamentally inextensive. So, and when we do that, then yes, they're countable. We can count them up, we can add them together, we can do all the things you can do with spatial multiplicities. But fundamentally, they're a different kind of multiplicity. That's the point that Bergson's making here. Right, let's have a quick look at a summary. So we started out looking at psychic states. We said they're characterized by intensity, and that nice description of intensity as a quality of shade spread over psychic states. So something that is, intensities affect you in the core of your being. They're not things that we can kind of isolate and break apart as if they were things in space. And each state is qualitatively different from every other state. So a progression from one state to another is not a change, it's not a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. You're making a qualitative leap. And so psychic states being intensive, being intensive, they're fundamentally inextensive. And the mistake that we make is to spatialize this fundamental intensity. And that leads us into many problems when we're trying to think about psychic states. The other thing we looked at were the two kinds of multiplicity. So we had the multiplicity of material objects, which are immediately countable. They're objective, so they appear as wholes, but they're things that we can break up into as many pieces as we want. They're continuous wholes. The other kind of multiplicity is that of psychic states. And here the way that we experience, so we feel psychic states, is we gather them together into a qualitative totality. I didn't actually talk about this in the body of the video, but gathering. Bergson talks about the sound of a bell ringing. So if it says ringing 5 times, it rings 5 times. When you experience that qualitatively as a psychic state, you kind of gather them together, not in a spatial sense, so that they're all 5 peals of the bell are existing, coexisting at the same time, but they appear one after another in succession. And that's the way that you gather them together as psychic states. So they're experienced, they're gathered together in time. And that's the idea with the multiplicity of psychic states. They're not countable as if they were things in space. They are countable, however, through a symbolic representation which necessarily takes place in space. We can conceptualize these things, put them side by side, count them, add them. But in order to do that, we have to take this extra step. We have to symbolize what was fundamentally inextensive. We have to symbolize it and project it into space. And so that is the first video. So that's kind of setting up the scene for the next video, where we'll look at duration. And duration is the living core, the beating heart of Bergson's philosophy. So this is very much a preamble to the next video. So stick around. I'll see you for that as soon as I get around to filming it. Thanks, guys.